Hello everyone, I am Shaohai Guo. Today I will discuss about the 10th Amendment in the United States Constitution. This amendment's text is as follows. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Now when Madison proposed this amendment, there were critics who claimed that the amendment was redundant to the rest of the Constitution. Other articles in the Constitution already explain what the federal government cannot do, what the states can do, or the people. The Supreme Court labeled this amendment in 1931 as a truism, that it didn't really bring anything new to the Constitution at the time of its ratification. But nevertheless, the amendment is still important, and there are many court cases dealing with this amendment even in our current day. After all, commitment to objectivity and honesty is essential to historical investigation. That is readily apparent in discussing this amendment. In America's judicial history, the 10th Amendment deals with quite a few disputes of doctrines and constitutional clauses. These include the anti-commandeering doctrine, the Commerce Clause, federal funding, and the Supremacy Clause. The anti-commandeering doctrine prevents the federal government from forcing state governments in enforcing federal statutes. A court case dealing with this violation of the 10th Amendment occurred this year in Murphy versus National Collegiate Athletic Association, the NCAA. This was the sports betting case. The Supreme Court ruled that the law prohibiting states who banned sports betting to then legalize sports betting later on was unconstitutional. This law was a federal statute, and by the federal government forcefully compelling the states to follow it, made it violate the 10th Amendment. It was a landmark victory for American sports gambling businesses. Now, this doesn't mean that we can't just disobey the federal government in all cases if the state says the action is fine, particularly in commerce. The Commerce Clause in the Constitution allows the federal government to closely regulate, create, and enforce laws to protect the American economy. One such Supreme Court decision was Gonzalez versus Reich in 2005, the federal law in question being the Controlled Substances Act. This was the case regarding a California citizen suing the federal government for seizing their grown medical marijuana, even though it was strictly for personal and not mercantile use. California legalized medical cannabis back then, after all, but the Supreme Court argued that just because she wasn't selling the cannabis could theoretically stream into interstate commerce in states which do not allow cannabis use. Thus, this would fall under the purview of the federal government, as trade flow goes throughout the states and is not strictly regionalized state by state, so no violation of 10th Amendment here. The next common violation would be in the category of federal funding. The Constitution limits the ability of the federal government to directly use the state government as a financial instrument. A case this decade which discussed this was the National Federation of Independent Business versus Sibelius. This was the Obamacare Supreme Court case, and that occurred in 2012. One specific part of the Obamacare legislation was in violation of the 10th Amendment, and that was the part regarding the expansion of Medicaid, because the Supreme Court ruled that that part was in violation, as the federal government was essentially forcing the states to expand their own Medicaid funding, which goes against the limitations of federal funding. The final type of 10th Amendment dispute I want to discuss is the Supremacy Clause. I'm sure all of you are familiar with Brown v. Board of Education. Well, segregationist states were unhappy with the ruling that this was unconstitutional and declared that it was the state's power to determine who entered into their schools. In the 1958 Supreme Court case, Cooper versus Aaron, the Supreme Court declared that, number one, the Constitution is the law of the land due to the Supremacy Clause. Number two, the Supreme Court is the supreme interpreter of the Constitution. And number three, that it's too bad that the states disagreed. They have to follow the laws anyway. So no violation of the 10th Amendment. Those are just 4 examples of how the 10th Amendment is used to solve major legal disputes in our country. It's clearly no longer a redundant amendment anymore, and expect its continued use in the future. Thank you very much and have a great day.